Okay, for our last installment, we'll talk about due process in schools. No, why do you have the right to due process in schools? Well, depends. No, in some of the cases here, because the students wanted to express or to exercise their right to free expression. In another case, it's because the professor's livelihood was at stake. No, and in another case, it's a damages case, no, not a due process case. It's a damages case claiming that he was deprived of due process, therefore he is entitled to due process. Okay? So, kasi sinabi natin in the beginning, di ba? You are entitled to due process when you, what is at stake is your life, liberty, and property. Okay, let's begin with Montemayor. In Montemayor, a professor in Araneta University Foundation was accused of sexual harassment. No? In the first case, he was charged. A tribunal was constituted to hear the case. He asked for a postponement. It was granted. He asked for a second postponement. It was no longer granted. And so, in the end, he was found guilty, but he was simply demoted. Okay. But this apparently emboldened the other victims. No? After he was found guilty, after the first victim, several others came forward and complained that they too were victims of the same professor. Okay. So again, he asked for a postponement of the hearing, but this time, siguro kasi may previous finding na of guilt, hindi na siya pinagbigyan. So the hearing proceeded without him being heard, and so he was found guilty. Okay? And terminated. So before the labor tribunal, he complained illegal termination until it reached the Supreme Court, where he claimed he was deprived of due process because he was never heard by the school. At sabi ng Supreme Court, even assuming for argument's sake, no, that the opportunity was not enough, the opportunity given to him to be heard was not enough. Still, sabi ng Supreme Court, it was an administrative proceeding. Okay? And the fact that from the school, he was able to go to the NLRC, and in the NLRC, he was heard. That therefore, sabi ng Supreme Court, any defect in the due process in the school was cured because he was eventually heard. Okay? He was heard by the labor court, and therefore, sabi ng Supreme Court, any defect in due process was cured. Okay? Now, what about Ateneo versus CA? Ateneo versus CA involved an Ateneo student, no, who, alam niyo naman ng mga Atenista, nakipag-away dun sa isang staff ng cafeteria. Okay? Kasi nainip siya, iniinit yung siopaw niya, so minura niya yung babae, lumaban, sinampal niya. Okay, maraming witnesses. Okay? So he was charged and he was asked to face a disciplinary tribunal. He attended. No? He's a college student. He attended, but did not finish it because he said, I have to go home, I have to go home. Iniwan na niya. Okay. And so he was eventually expelled. The family, who is a prominent family in Bacolod, filed a damages case in Bacolod claiming a right of due process violation of his right to due process entitles them to damages. Okay. When it reached the Supreme Court, sabi ng Supreme Court, he was not, because it was his parents who filed the case for damages. Sabi ng Supreme Court, the parents had no right to be heard. Why not? Because it was the student who was being charged. And the student was of age, who was an adult. So, whether or not he told his parents was up to him already at that point. So the parents were never deprived of their right to be heard because their right was not at stake. It was their child's right that was at stake. And he was informed, he in fact attended, he was not deprived of due process. Now, why was his parents excluded? That was the decision of their adult child. Okay? Non versus Dames is an interesting case because it reversed an earlier case. Okay? It talks about the contract theory in Alcuas. What is the contract theory in Alcuas? In Alcuas and in Non versus Dames, this involves students who were protesting, conducting a rally inside the campus. Okay? In Alcuas versus PSBA, they conducted a rally inside the campus. And so the school alleged that the conduct of the rally was in violation of their disciplinary rules. So they created a tribunal who were supposed to be hearing the case. But they were not able to terminate the hearings. Natapos ang semester. So before the start of the next semester, these students tried to enroll and they were denied enrollment. The school simply refused to accept them. Okay? So in Alcuas, the Supreme Court, so of course they went to court. Okay? But in Alcuas, the Supreme Court did not side with the students. No? Even if there was no finding of guilt of violating the school disciplinary rules. The Supreme Court in the Alcuas case said that a student enters into a contract with the school every semester. And like any other contract, sabi ng Supreme Court, no party can be compelled to enter into a contract na hindi niya gusto. Because it is a contract. Therefore, sabi niya, the school had every right to refuse to enter into that contract in the next semester. That is the so-called Alcuas contract theory. Okay. Buti na lang in Non versus Dames, exactly the same situation. Rally ran inside the school, alleged to have violated the disciplinary rules of the school, never found guilty, but were refused enrollment. The school in Non versus Dames was invoking the Supreme Court ruling in Alcuas. Buti na lang, Supreme Court this time became more for lack of a better term, progressive, and said it is time to abandon the contract theory of Alcuas. Okay? Why? The students in Non versus Dames were simply exercising their right to free expression. That included peaceful assemblies, that included petitioning the government for redress of grievances. So, their constitutional right to expression must be respected even by the school. Because as the Supreme Court said in this case, the students do not shed their constitutional rights upon entering the school gate. Okay? So, the Alcuas contract theory was abandoned, and here in Non versus Dames, the Supreme Court expressly stated that their right to freedom of the students' right to freedom of expression must be respected, and they should not be punished for exercising it. Okay? So, we will proceed with equal protection in our next meeting. So I hope that I have covered everything that we should be covering as I promised you, and then we will talk about equal protection in the next meeting. Thank you.